You know, having worked as a plumber for 6 years, I got used to the fact that people perceive me as a temporary inconvenience. They call when something is leaking or clogged, and then they want to get rid of my presence as quickly as possible. And I was completely satisfied with that. Work is work, and personal life is something completely different. Although, to be honest, I didn't really have a personal life until the last call. That Tuesday started out like any other. I was sitting in my one-bedroom apartment, drinking coffee and scrolling through requests on my phone. Most were standard fare: a clogged bathtub, a leaky cistern, a faucet replacement. But one request stood out. The address was in Bel Air, the most expensive part of town, and the order was $1,500 for a simple faucet repair. That was 3 times my standard rate. My first thought was, a scam. Fraudsters often use inflated prices to attract attention and then demand prepayment. But the phone number was local, and the description of the problem sounded quite real: a leaking faucet in the bathroom. I decided to call back. The voice on the phone was pleasant, soft, with a slight accent that I couldn't place. The man introduced himself as Daniel and explained that he was willing to pay extra for the urgency and quality of the work. He said that he was leaving on a business trip in 2 days, and the leak was causing serious inconvenience. When I asked why the price was so high, he simply replied that it wasn't a problem for him, and that a good repairman was worth the money. Something in his voice made me agree. Maybe it was the fatigue of small orders, or maybe it was curiosity. We agreed on 4 o'clock in the afternoon. The drive to Bel Air always reminded me of how different the worlds of people living in the same city can be. My old tool van looked out of place among the shiny sports cars and perfectly manicured lawns. Daniel's house was a 2-story, modern mansion with large windows and a minimalist design. I parked in the driveway, checked the tools in my bag, and headed to the front door. The door was opened by a man in his mid-30s, maybe a little older. Tall, slim, with dark hair and attentive brown eyes. He was dressed in expensive casual clothes, dark jeans and a light sweater that probably cost more than I spend on food in a month. But what struck me most was his smile. Sincere, warm, without the condescension I often saw in wealthy clients. He greeted me by name, even though I didn't remember introducing myself, and invited me in. The interior of the house was stunning. Open floor plan, high ceilings, expensive furniture arranged tastefully. Everything was done in neutral tones with bright accents. I could tell right away that Daniel either had a keen eye for design or had spent a fortune on a decorator. He led me up to the 2nd floor, to the master bathroom, and I realized I had entered another world. The bathroom was the size of my living room, with marble walls, a huge tub, and a separate shower. At the center of it all was an elegant faucet, dripping water slowly but insistently. I looked at the problem and realized it was a really simple job, just a few gaskets to replace and some connections to tighten. Half an hour's work at most. I felt awkward about charging $1,500 for such a trifle, but Daniel said he was completely happy with the price. Usually when I work, the owners either go about their business or watch from afar, ready to run away at any moment. But Daniel stayed. He didn't interfere, didn't ask stupid questions, but his presence was noticeable. I felt his gaze on me while I was disassembling the mixer. Working under such scrutiny was unusual but not unpleasant. I usually turn on music or a podcast to pass the time, but the house was silent except for the sound of my tools. Daniel leaned against the doorframe, silently watching my movements. As I was changing the gaskets, he asked how long I had been a plumber. I told him I had been for 6 years, since I graduated from vocational school. He nodded and said it must be an interesting job. New people, new problems every day. I chuckled and said it was mostly the same problems in different houses. His next question caught me off guard. He asked if I liked working with my hands, creating things, or fixing broken things. I paused for a moment, wrench in hand. No one had ever asked me that. Usually, people only wanted to know how much it would cost and how quickly I could finish it. I said yes, I like to feel how things work, to understand why something breaks and how to fix it. There is something satisfying about taking something that is broken and making it work again. Daniel smiled and said he understood that feeling. When I finished the job, the mixer worked like new. I gathered my tools and was about to leave when Daniel offered me coffee. It broke all my rules. I never stayed with a client longer than the job required. But something in his manner, the sincerity of the offer, made me agree. We walked down to the kitchen, which was as impressive as the rest of the house. Daniel made coffee in an expensive coffee machine, and I sat at the marble island, feeling out of place. My work boots felt rough on the immaculate floor, and my hands, even after washing, still looked like they were working amid all the elegance. But Daniel didn't seem to notice. He handed me the coffee in a nice cup and sat down opposite me. The coffee was excellent, much better than the instant mix I drank at home. I complimented him on it, and Daniel smiled, saying that it was one of his weaknesses: good coffee. The conversation started with the usual stuff: the weather, work, the city, but gradually it became more personal. Daniel told me that he works as an interior designer, which explained his impeccable taste in home decoration. He said that he moved to this city 3 years ago from New York when he received an offer from a large design company. I told him a little about myself, how I became a plumber, how I live alone and like it. Daniel listened attentively without interrupting, and his questions showed that he was genuinely interested in what I was saying. When I mentioned that I lived alone, he said he understood the feeling. He said that he lived alone too, that his job took up a lot of his time, and that a serious relationship required energy he didn't have right now. But I heard something in his voice that sounded like loneliness. Time flew by. We talked about life, about work, about what makes us happy. Daniel talked about his projects, about how he likes to create spaces where people feel at home. I shared my thoughts about how nice it is to solve people's problems, even if they don't think about it. But the strangest thing was how easy it was for me to talk to him. I'm not usually one to open up to strangers. My social circle was limited to colleagues and neighbors, with whom I exchanged no more than a few phrases. And here I was, telling a virtual stranger about my thoughts and feelings. Daniel seemed to relax, too. He talked about his loneliness, about how hard it is to connect with people when everyone only sees you through the prism of your success or money. He said that sometimes it feels like he's in a gilded cage, beautiful but isolated. I looked at my watch and realized that I had been with him for 2 hours. This was completely unlike me. I stood up abruptly, thanked him for the coffee, and said that I had to go. Daniel looked surprised by my sudden haste, but did not insist. He walked me to the door and handed me an envelope of money. When our hands touched as we handed over the envelope, I felt something that made me quickly pull my hand away. It wasn't just a touch, it was something more, something that scared me with its unexpectedness. I said a quick goodbye and walked out to the car. As I was getting into the van, I heard Daniel say that if I had time, I could always stop by just to talk. I nodded, but I knew I wasn't coming back. It was too dangerous. All the way home, I thought about what had happened. I couldn't figure out what it was that had unsettled me so. Maybe it was the ease with which I had opened up to a stranger. Maybe it was how comfortable I felt in his presence. Or maybe it was what was happening to me when I looked at him. At home, I counted the money, and the amount was indeed $1,500, more than I earned in a normal week. But instead of joy, I felt confused. I couldn't get our conversation, his smile, the way he listened to me out of my head. I tried to do normal things, watch TV, read the news, cook dinner, but my thoughts kept returning to Daniel. I couldn't understand what was happening to me. I had always been a rather withdrawn person, preferring solitude to the company of others. I had had relationships with women, but they had never been serious or long-lasting. But something about Daniel made me feel different. Maybe it was his attention, the way he looked at me, as if I was interesting to him for more than just being a plumber. Or maybe it was his openness, his willingness to share his thoughts and feelings. I went to bed, but I couldn't fall asleep for a long time. Thoughts about Daniel haunted me. I imagined his house, his kitchen, our conversation. And every time I remembered the moment when our hands touched, I felt something strange in my chest. I woke up in the morning with a firm decision to forget about this incident. It was just an unusual order, nothing more. Daniel was the client, I did the job, got the money. The story is over. But deep down, I knew it was not that simple. I spent the next few days trying to live my normal life, taking orders, fixing faucets and pipes, coming home tired and trying not to think about that Tuesday. But Daniel seemed to be in my thoughts. I found myself remembering his voice, his smile, the way he looked at me while I worked. On Friday morning, a familiar number called me. My heart started beating faster when I saw it on the screen. I hesitated for a few seconds before answering. Daniel sounded worried. He said there were problems again in the guest bathroom, this time with the shower. Water was leaking out from under the shower tray, and he was afraid it might damage the floor. He asked if I could come today. I could have refused. I could have said I was busy, recommended another artist. But I heard something in his voice that made me agree. Maybe it was a note of loneliness that I recognized because I often felt the same way. We agreed on 2 o'clock in the afternoon. I spent the morning in anxiety, not understanding why a simple work call was so upsetting to me. I even took a shower and put on my best work clothes, although usually such trifles did not bother me. When I arrived, Daniel greeted me with the same warm smile. He was dressed in dark jeans and a white shirt, and looked even better than I remembered. We said hello, and he led me to the guest bathroom on the first floor. The problem was indeed serious. The sealant around the shower tray had broken down, and water was seeping under the tiles. It was a job that would take several hours. The old sealant had to be removed, the surface dried, and new sealant applied. I started working and felt his gaze on me again. But this time, it didn't bother me. On the contrary, his presence calmed me down. We started talking, and I realized that I had missed our communication. Daniel talked about his work, about a difficult client who couldn't decide on the design of his living room. He spoke with such passion about colors, textures, and shapes that I began to understand how creative his work could be. I had never thought of design as something serious, but listening to him, I realized that it required at least as much skill as my work. At one point, he asked me if I had a hobby. I laughed and said that after work, I usually only have energy for TV and beer. But then I added that I sometimes read, mostly detectives and thrillers, nothing serious. Daniel said he loved reading too, especially the classics. We started talking about books, and I was surprised to find that we shared some of our favorite authors. He didn't seem like the snob I'd imagined him to be. On the contrary, he seemed genuinely interested in what I was reading and didn't judge me for my simple tastes. The work progressed slowly because I was constantly distracted by the conversation. I usually work quickly and efficiently, but now I didn't want to finish. I enjoyed our conversation, his attention, the fact that someone found me interesting. As I was applying the new sealant, Daniel asked me why I chose this profession. I told him the truth, that after school, I didn't know what I wanted to do, tried several jobs, but nothing suited me. Until I accidentally got an apprenticeship with an old plumber who taught me the trade. I said that at first it was just a job, a way to make money. But gradually, I realized that I liked solving people's problems, fixing what was broken. There is something honest in this work. You either cope with the task or you don't. No politics, no games. Daniel listened attentively, and when I finished, he said he envied me. I was surprised. What could a successful designer envy about a simple plumber? He explained that he envied the clarity of my work, the fact that I could see a problem and solve it. In his work, everything is much more complicated. Tastes are subjective, clients are capricious, and the result does not always depend on skills. I finished the job by 4 o'clock in the afternoon. The shower was like new, the sealant was neatly applied, all the leaks were fixed. I gathered up my tools and was about to leave when Daniel offered me coffee again. This time I didn't hesitate. We went into the kitchen again, and he made the same excellent coffee. But the atmosphere was different, more relaxed, more intimate. We sat closer together, and I noticed details I hadn't seen the last time. I noticed how Daniel held his cup, gracefully, with both hands, as if he was warming himself. I noticed a small scar on his left hand, which he got when he fell off his bike as a child. I noticed how he smiled not only with his lips, but also with his eyes. We talked about life, dreams, what makes us happy. Daniel said that he always dreamed of opening his own design studio, but for now he works for a company, accumulating experience and connections. He said that sometimes he feels trapped. He has everything for a comfortable life, but something is missing. I realized he was talking about loneliness, the same feeling I knew all too well. I told him about my life, how I had grown accustomed to being alone, how it seemed easier that way. No one disappointed. No one asked for more than you could give. Daniel nodded, understanding. He said he thought so too, that loneliness was freedom. But sometimes he wakes up in this big house and feels like he's in a museum. Beautiful, but empty. Our conversation became increasingly personal. We talked about fears, about what prevents us from being happy. Daniel admitted that he was afraid of intimacy because people often saw only success and money in him. I said that I was afraid to open up to people because they might leave. At some point, our eyes met and lingered. I felt something electric between us, something that made my heart beat faster. Daniel felt it too. I saw it in his eyes. We sat in silence for a few seconds, and I realized that something big was happening, something game-changing, something that scared me more than I cared to admit. I stood up abruptly, thanked him for the coffee, and said I had to go. Daniel looked surprised and a little offended by my sudden haste. He asked if everything was okay, and I lied that I had another order. He walked me to the door, and as I was leaving, he said he hoped to see me again soon. I nodded but didn't turn around. I knew that if I looked at him, I wouldn't be able to leave. At home, I sat in my chair for a long time, trying to understand what was happening to me. I couldn't deny that I liked Daniel, not just as an interesting conversationalist, but as a man. It scared me because I had never felt anything like this about another man. I always considered myself heterosexual. I had relationships with women, and they satisfied me. But what I felt for Daniel was completely different, deeper, more intense. I tried to convince myself that it was just friendship, that I enjoyed his company because he was an interesting person. But I knew it wasn't. The way I looked at him, the way I responded to his touch, the way I thought about him, all of it spoke of something more. That evening I went to a bar, hoping that alcohol would help me forget about Daniel. But even after a few beers, I kept thinking about him, about his smile, about his voice, about how easy it was to talk to him. I realized I was falling in love with him, and this realization terrified me. I didn't know what to do about it, how to act. I had never been in a situation like this. All my ideas about myself, about my sexuality, about what I wanted from life, were suddenly called into question. I spent the next few days avoiding his calls. He called on Saturday, but I didn't answer. Then on Sunday, but I ignored him again. I knew I was being a coward, but I didn't know what else to do. On Tuesday, he sent a message. "Alex, I hope I didn't say anything wrong. If I offended you, I apologize. Just wanted to know you were okay." I read that message dozens of times. There was genuine concern in it that touched me more than I cared to admit. But I didn't know what to say, how to explain that the problem wasn't him, but me, that I wasn't running from him, but from my feelings. I didn't reply to the message, but it haunted me. I realized I couldn't just disappear from his life without explaining why. It wasn't fair to him, and it wasn't fair to myself. On Thursday night, I was sitting at home, drinking beer and watching TV, but I couldn't concentrate on the program. My thoughts kept returning to Daniel. I imagined him alone in that big house, probably wondering what he had done wrong. I realized I had to do something, either have an honest conversation with him about my feelings or disappear from his life completely. Continuing to ignore him was mean. He deserved honesty, even if that honesty was painful. But I still wasn't ready for this conversation. I didn't know how to explain something I didn't fully understand myself. How do you tell someone you're falling in love with them when you're not sure what that means? I decided to give myself some more time. Maybe these feelings would pass. Maybe I was just going through a midlife crisis or something. But deep down, I knew I was fooling myself. A week of silence passed. I took orders, worked, tried to live a normal life. But Daniel was on my mind. Every day I waited for his call, but the phone was silent. I realized that he had accepted my silence as an answer and would not insist anymore. It should have made my life easier, but instead I felt worse. I missed our conversations, his smile, the way he listened to me. I realized that in those 2 meetings, he had become an important part of my life, and his absence left a void. On Monday morning, I was working for an elderly couple, fixing a clogged kitchen sink. The lady brought me some tea and started telling me about her grandson who had recently gotten married. She talked about how important it is to find someone who understands you, who makes you a better person. Her words echoed with pain in my chest. I realized that this is what I felt with Daniel: understanding, acceptance, a desire to be better, and I lost it because of my fear. On Tuesday, I was at the hardware store buying parts when I saw a familiar figure in the aisle next to me. Daniel had his back to me, examining paint samples. My heart started beating faster and my mouth went dry. I could have approached him, spoken to him, explained my behavior, but instead, I quickly paid for the purchases and left the store, feeling like a complete coward. I spent the rest of the day berating myself for this cowardice. On Wednesday night, I was at home, eating dinner and watching the news, when my phone rang. My heart jumped. The number was unfamiliar, but for some reason, I hoped it was Daniel calling from another phone. But it was just a woman who needed her leaky cistern fixed. The disappointment was so acute that I realized I can't live like this anymore. I have to decide something. Either forget about Daniel completely or find the courage to talk to him. On Thursday morning, while taking a shower, I made a decision. I would call Daniel, apologize for my behavior, and try to explain the situation. Maybe we could remain friends. Maybe he would understand my confusion. But when I picked up the phone, my courage deserted me. What would I say? How would I explain that I had ignored him for a week because I had fallen in love with him? How would I confess to feelings that I didn't fully understand? I put my phone down and went to work, promising myself that I would call in the evening. But in the evening, I found excuses again, and this went on for several days. On Saturday night, I was sitting at home, drinking beer and feeling miserable. I realized that I was turning into the person I had always despised, a coward who couldn't make a decision and act on it. That's when the message came, from Daniel. My hands were shaking as I opened it. "Alex, I know you probably don't want to see me, but I can't stop thinking about our conversations. If you're ready to talk, I'll be at O'Malley's on Main Street tonight around 8 p.m. Come by if you want. No strings attached." O'Malley's was a small Irish pub in the city center. I knew the place. I sometimes went there after a particularly hard day at work. It was a quiet place, not too noisy, perfect for conversation. I looked at my watch. It was 6:30. I had time to shower, change, and get there. Or I could ignore the message, like I had been doing all week. But something in the tone of the message, his willingness to risk rejection, made me decide. I took a quick shower, put on my best jeans and shirt, and drove to O'Malley's. As I walked into the pub, my heart was beating so loudly I thought the whole room could hear it. I looked around and saw Daniel at a table in the corner. He had his back to the wall and his face lit up when he saw me. I walked up to the table, feeling awkward. Daniel stood up and extended his hand for a handshake. His handshake was warm and firm, and I felt the same electricity as before. We sat down and the waitress came to take our order. I ordered a beer, Daniel a whiskey. We were silent for the first few minutes, studying our drinks. Finally, Daniel spoke. He said he was glad to see me, that he had been afraid I would never show up again. His voice sounded sincere without reproach or resentment. I apologized for my behavior, saying I didn't mean to offend him. Daniel shook his head and said he understood that sometimes people need space, but he added that he missed our conversations. I admitted that I missed him too, that I thought about him every day, but I didn't know what to say. Daniel looked at me carefully and asked if he had done something wrong. I shook my head and said that the problem wasn't him, it was me, that I was confused about my feelings and didn't know how to deal with them. Daniel nodded as if he understood what I was talking about. We drank a few sips in silence. Then Daniel said that he wanted to be honest with me, that he too felt something unusual between us, something that went beyond ordinary friendship. His words struck me. I looked at him, not knowing what to say. He continued, saying that he understood if it scared me, that for a long time he himself could not understand what was happening. I asked if he meant what I thought he meant. Daniel nodded and said yes, that he found me attractive, that our conversations meant more to him than just friendly chats. My heart was beating so fast I was afraid he would hear it. I never thought he could feel the same way. I confessed that I felt attracted to him too, but it scared me because I had never felt anything like this with a man before. Daniel smiled and said he understood the confusion. He had gone through it himself a few years ago when he first realized he was bisexual. He said it was okay to explore your feelings. We talked for another hour, slowly draining our glasses. The conversation was honest and open. Daniel shared his experience of self-awareness, how difficult it was to accept his sexuality. I shared my fears and doubts. As the pub began to close, we went outside. It was a warm spring evening and the streets were full of people. We walked slowly to our cars, not wanting to end the conversation. When we reached my van, Daniel stopped and looked at me. His eyes were almost black in the streetlight. He said he didn't want to rush me, that he understood I needed time. But then he added that if I was willing to try, he was willing too. Willing to slowly, carefully explore what was going on between us. I stood there, looking at him, feeling fear and desire fighting inside me. Fear of the unknown, fear of changing my life, fear of disappointment, but also a desire to be with him, a desire to know where it might lead. Daniel took a step closer and I could smell him, a thin, expensive cologne mingling with the natural scent of his skin. He slowly raised his hand and touched my cheek. His touch was gentle, questioning. He looked into my eyes, waiting for a reaction. I could have pulled away, said it was too fast, but instead, I covered his hand with mine. We stood there for a few moments, looking at each other in the streetlight. Then Daniel slowly leaned toward me. I could have stopped him, but I didn't. Our first kiss was cautious, almost timid. His lips were soft and warm, and his hand was still on my cheek. It was nothing like kissing women. A different feeling, a different taste, a different energy. When we broke the kiss, I felt dizzy. Daniel looked at me with a question in his eyes. I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded. He smiled and said he'd like to invite me to dinner tomorrow. Not to work, but just as a man he's interested in. I hesitated for only a moment, then agreed. We agreed on 7 o'clock. Daniel kissed me lightly on the cheek and walked to his car. The whole way home I thought about what had happened. About the kiss, about his proposal, about me saying yes. Part of me was panicking. What was I doing? Where was this going? But another part was full of anticipation. At home, I lay awake for a long time, touching my lips and remembering the feeling of his kiss. I knew that tomorrow everything could change, that this could be the beginning of something important or a catastrophic mistake. But for the first time in a long time, I felt alive. Really alive. The next day dragged on endlessly. I took 2 orders in the morning, but worked absent-mindedly, constantly thinking about the upcoming evening. My thoughts swung between anticipation and panic. What have I done? Am I ready for this? After lunch, I went home and spent more time getting ready than I ever had in my life. I took a long shower, shaved thoroughly, tried on half my wardrobe. I ended up choosing dark jeans and a blue shirt. Nothing special, but it was the best I had. On the way to Daniel's, I stopped twice, ready to turn around and go home. But each time, I forced myself to continue on. I bought a bottle of wine at the store, although I knew little about alcohol more expensive than beer. My hands were shaking as I parked in front of his house. I sat in the car for a few minutes, trying to calm myself. It was just dinner, I told myself. A conversation. No big deal. Daniel opened the door before I could ring the bell. He was wearing dark pants and a light gray sweater that brought out the color of his eyes. He looked amazing, and I felt a familiar tightening in my chest. He smiled when he saw the bottle of wine in my hands and said it wasn't necessary, but he appreciated the gesture. He led me inside and I immediately smelled food cooking, something with garlic and herbs that made my mouth water. The setting was different than during my work visits. The lights were dim, candles burned on the kitchen island, and soft jazz music played on the speakers. It all created an intimate, romantic atmosphere that both attracted and terrified me. Daniel opened my wine and poured us each a glass. We clinked glasses and he said he was glad I came. I said I was too, although I was nervous. He laughed and admitted he was just as nervous as I was. It was comforting to know that he was insecure too. I always imagined people like Daniel as having everything under control, always knowing what they were doing. But his honesty about his own doubts made him more human, more approachable. We went into the kitchen where he was making seafood pasta. I offered to help, but he said it was almost done. Instead, he asked me to tell him about my day while he finished cooking. I told him about my orders, about the old woman who insisted on buying me homemade cookies, about the man who tried to fix the faucet himself and only made the problem worse. Daniel laughed at the right places, asked questions, showing that he was really listening. When the food was ready, we sat down at a small table in the corner of the kitchen. The pasta was delicious, complex, sophisticated, and not at all like the simple food I was used to. Daniel told me he learned to cook in New York when he was living alone and tired of restaurant food. The conversation flowed smoothly from topic to topic. We talked about work, about hobbies, about places we would like to visit. I told him about my dream of one day buying a house with a big garage where I could restore old cars. Daniel shared his plans to open his own studio. Gradually, I relaxed. The wine helped, but most importantly, it was the same ease of communication that I had felt from the beginning. With Daniel, I could be myself, without pretending to be someone else. After dinner, we moved into the living room. Daniel put on some new music, something more modern but still soft. We sat on the sofa, and I noticed that he chose the seat next to me rather than opposite me. We continued to talk, but the atmosphere became more intimate. Daniel spoke more quietly, occasionally touching my hand to emphasize a point. Each touch sent electrical impulses through my skin. At some point, the conversation died down. We sat there, looking at each other, the air between us almost sparkling with tension. Daniel slowly reached out and touched my face, just as he had done the night before. This time, I didn't hesitate. I leaned toward him and we kissed again. This kiss was deeper, more confident than the last. I felt his hand tangle in my hair, his breathing quicken. When we broke the kiss, Daniel looked into my eyes and quietly asked if I wanted to stay, not to work, not to talk, if I wanted to be with him. My heart was pounding so hard, I was sure he could hear it. I knew that if I said yes, there would be no turning back, that it would change everything, my understanding of myself, my sexuality, my future. But looking into his eyes, seeing in them the same desire and the same uncertainty that I felt myself, I realized that I was ready to take a risk. I nodded, not trusting my voice. Daniel smiled softly, relieved, and took my hand. We rose from the couch, and he led me upstairs to his bedroom. The room was done in the same minimalist style as the rest of the house. A large bed, simple lines, subdued lighting. Daniel lit a few candles, creating a soft, warm glow. We stood by the bed looking at each other. I felt like I was standing on the edge of a precipice, ready to jump, but not knowing what was waiting for me below. Daniel came closer and kissed me again. His hands slid to the buttons of my shirt and he looked at me questioningly. I nodded and he slowly began to unbutton them. His touch was gentle, careful. He studied my reaction to each movement, ready to stop at the first sign of discomfort. But there was no discomfort, only a growing desire and surprise at how right it felt. When he removed my shirt, I felt vulnerable. My body was a worker's body, strong, but scarred and calloused, not at all as refined as his. But Daniel looked at me with admiration, his hands gently exploring my chest and shoulders. I began to unbutton his sweater, surprised at my own boldness. His skin was smooth and warm under my hands. We kissed, touched each other, slowly removing the rest of his clothes. As we lay down on the bed, Daniel asked me if I was sure I wanted to continue. I said yes, even though my heart was pounding like crazy with nervousness and anticipation. What happened next was both familiar and completely new. Familiar because physical intimacy is physical intimacy. New because this was a different person, with a different body, different reactions, different energy. Daniel was a patient and attentive partner. He showed me what he liked and carefully explored what I liked. Every touch, every kiss was filled with tenderness and passion. I was surprised at how natural it felt. All my fears and doubts dissolved in waves of pleasure and intimacy. It felt right, on some deep, intuitive level. Then we lay in each other's arms, breathing heavily and sweating. Daniel gently stroked my back, and I listened to his heartbeat. I felt changed, as if some important piece of the puzzle of my personality had finally fallen into place. We didn't talk for a long time, just lay in silence, enjoying the closeness. Then Daniel quietly asked how I felt. I thought about the answer and said honestly, different. Good, different. He smiled and kissed the top of my head. He said he was glad I had decided to take this step, that it was special for him too. I asked him what would happen next. He said he didn't know, but he wanted to find out. He wanted to explore what was between us, slowly and carefully. I felt relieved that he didn't demand immediate answers or commitment. I didn't know what this meant for my life, for my future, but I knew I wanted to try. We talked for a while longer, then I started to get ready to go home. Daniel asked if I wanted to stay the night, but I said I wasn't ready for that yet. I needed time to process what had happened. He understood and didn't insist. He walked me to the door and kissed me goodbye. He said he would call tomorrow if I didn't mind. All the way home, I thought about what had happened, about how it had changed my understanding of myself, about how I felt about Daniel, about where this might lead. At home, I took a shower and went to bed, but it took me a long time to fall asleep. My body still remembered his touch, and my mind was trying to comprehend the new reality. I was no longer the same person I had been that morning, and it was both frightening and exciting. The next morning was strange. I woke up feeling like the world had changed, even though everything looked exactly the same outside the window. I lay in bed, remembering the previous evening, and couldn't believe that it had actually happened. Part of me expected to feel regret or shame, but there was none. Instead, I felt a kind of peace, as if I had been searching for something for a long time and had finally found it. Daniel called mid-afternoon while I was changing pads in a young family's bathroom. I apologized to the customers and went out to answer. His voice sounded a little uncertain. He asked how I felt, if I regretted what had happened. I told him honestly, no, I don't. Something in my tone must have convinced him, because he began to speak more relaxedly. He suggested meeting on the weekend, just spending time together, going somewhere, talking. I agreed, and we agreed on Saturday. The rest of the week passed in a strange state of anticipation. I worked as usual, but my thoughts kept returning to Daniel, to what had happened between us, to how it had changed my understanding of myself. On Friday evening, I was sitting at home, drinking beer and thinking about tomorrow's meeting. Suddenly, the doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting guests and was surprised to see Daniel through the peephole. I opened the door and he was standing there with a bottle of wine and a bag from an expensive restaurant. He apologized for coming unannounced, but said he couldn't wait to see me tomorrow. I invited him in, suddenly realizing how modest my apartment was compared to his. A small one-room apartment, simple furniture, nothing fancy. But Daniel looked around with interest, not judgment. He said he liked the atmosphere. Cozy, real. Not a museum, but a place where people really live. This remark touched me more than any compliment. We had dinner with the food he brought. Expensive Asian food I had never tried. We sat on my old couch, ate with chopsticks, and talked about everything and nothing. The atmosphere was different than in his house. Less formal, more intimate. Maybe because it was my space, or because we had already crossed a certain line. After dinner, we stayed on the couch, and the conversation became more serious. Daniel asked if I thought about what was going on between us. I said that I thought about it all the time, but I still couldn't fully understand my feelings. He nodded understandingly. He told me about his own experience of discovering bisexuality in his early 20s, how it had scared him at first, made him question everything he thought he knew about himself. But then he realized it was just another side of himself that he hadn't noticed before. I asked him how he dealt with the reactions of those around him. Daniel answered honestly that he had lost several friends and that his relationship with his parents had become more difficult. But he had also gained a deeper understanding of himself and more sincere relationships with those who remained close. We talked about fears, about social pressure, about how difficult it is to change established ideas about yourself. Daniel did not try to convince me of anything or rush me into decisions. He simply shared his experience and listened to my doubts. At one point, he took my hand and said that it didn't matter how I defined myself or what labels I used. What mattered was how I felt and what I wanted. That there was a connection between us that couldn't be ignored. I agreed with him. The connection was real, strong, different from anything I had experienced before. I said I wanted to try to develop a relationship with him, slowly and carefully. Daniel smiled and kissed me, softly, tenderly, without rushing. This time I didn't feel unsure. It felt natural, right? We kissed on my old couch, and I realized I was falling more and more in love with him, not just physically, but emotionally. I loved his intelligence, his sense of humor, his ability to listen. I loved the way he made me feel interesting, worthy of attention. When we broke the kiss, Daniel asked if he could stay the night. This time I agreed without hesitation. We went into my small bedroom, where the double bed barely fit. That night was different than our first intimacy. Less hesitant, more passionate. We explored each other with new understanding, with growing intimacy. I was surprised at how quickly my body adapted to the new sensations, how naturally I responded to his touch. In the morning, I woke up before Daniel and spent a few minutes just looking at him. He looked younger in his sleep, more vulnerable. His dark hair was tousled and his face was relaxed and calm. I felt a surge of tenderness that surprised me with its strength. When Daniel woke up, he smiled at me and said good morning. We lay in bed, hugging, and I felt happier than I ever remembered. I made breakfast, simple bacon and eggs, nothing special. But Daniel ate it with such appetite as if it were a delicacy. He said that home-cooked food always tastes better than restaurant food, especially when it is cooked by someone special. We sat at my small kitchen table, drinking coffee and making plans for the weekend. Daniel offered to show me his favorite places in the city, and I promised to teach him how to change the oil in his car. He admitted that he had never done anything like that. At that moment, I realized that we were starting to build something real. Not just physical attraction or a temporary infatuation, but a relationship, with all its complexities, joys, and uncertainties. The next few weeks passed in a blur. We saw each other every few days, sometimes at my place, sometimes at his. Gradually, our lives began to intertwine. Daniel met my few friends, and I met his colleagues. The reactions were varied. Some people were understanding of our relationship, others were surprised or disapproving. But Daniel taught me to ignore other people's opinions and focus on what was important to us. My job hadn't changed. I still fixed faucets and pipes all over town. But now I had something to look forward to at the end of the day. Someone who cared about my business, who shared my joys and worries. Daniel has changed too. He has become more open, more relaxed. He said that our relationship gives him what he was missing: real closeness, acceptance, a sense of home. We didn't rush into making any big decisions. We didn't talk about a future together or moving in. We just enjoyed the present, got to know each other better, and built trust and intimacy. About a month after our first night together, we had a conversation that changed everything. We were sitting in his garden, drinking wine and watching the sunset. Daniel suddenly became serious and said he wanted to talk to me about something important. My heart sank with fear. I thought he wanted to end the relationship, but instead he said he was in love with me. Really, deeply in love, and he wanted to know how I felt. I looked at him, this amazing man who changed my life in such a short time. The man who taught me a new way to love, a new understanding of myself. I told him the truth, that I had fallen in love too, that he had become the most important part of my life, that I couldn't imagine a future without him. We kissed under the stars, and I felt like we were moving to a new level of intimacy. This wasn't just attraction or infatuation. This was love. Real, deep, life-changing love. That night, for the first time, we seriously talked about the future, about the possibility of living together, about how to combine our very different lives. We didn't make any final decisions, but for the first time, we began to think of ourselves as a couple with a shared future. Now, 3 months later, I'm still working as a plumber, still fixing faucets and pipes, still driving around town in my old van. But now I have a home to come home to, a man who loves me for who I am. Daniel doesn't try to change me or my work. On the contrary, he says that my honesty and hard work inspire him, and I admire his creativity and passion for his work. We have found a balance between our worlds. Sometimes I spend evenings in his elegant house, and sometimes he comes to my modest apartment. We cook together, watch movies, just talk. And every day I thank fate for the leaky faucet that led me to him, for the decision to accept an unusual order, for the courage to risk my established ideas about myself. Love, it turns out, can come from anywhere. Sometimes it comes in the form of a plumber with dirty hands and simple dreams. Sometimes it comes in the form of a designer in an expensive house. But when it's real, it changes everything. I'm still learning how to be in a relationship, learning how to love and be loved. But with Daniel by my side, this process doesn't feel like a test. It feels like an adventure. The most important adventure of my life. Next week, we are planning to go on holiday together, to a lake where we can fish and just be alone together. Daniel has never fished, and I have never been to a spa hotel. We are going to try both. This is what our relationship has become. A constant exploration of new territories, both emotional and practical. And each discovery makes our bond stronger. Sometimes I think about the person I was before I met Daniel. Lonely, withdrawn, content with simple pleasures. I don't regret that life. It got me to where I am today. But I am eternally grateful that I had the courage to change it. Love takes courage. The courage to open up, to take risks, to change your ideas about yourself and the world. But the reward is worth the risk. Because true love is more than just a feeling. It's a transformation. It's becoming the best version of yourself. And every morning, when I wake up next to Daniel or get a text from him wishing me a good day, I know I made the right choice. That sometimes the best things in life come when you least expect them. A leaky faucet changed my life. And now I understand that sometimes what seems like a simple breakdown is actually the beginning of something beautiful.